Young Girl is the 8th episode of the 5th season of Everybody Loves Raymond. This is directed by Michael Zinberg, and as always there will be spoilers from now as I go through the episode and share some thoughts. And I really enjoyed this one. I thought this was a really great episode, and not what I expected, at least. Something happens that I didn't see coming. I'd seen this episode before, but many, many years ago, and thankfully, I couldn't remember what happened because I rather enjoyed it. This starts off with Robert coming over to Debra and Ray's, and he introduces his new girlfriend, Erica. Erica is played by Tinsley Grimes, and one of the twins asks her how old she is. And she says 22. And nobody makes a big deal out of it. Marie does give a look to Debra and Ray, but nobody says anything. And when she leaves, there is a bit of a discussion, and Debra tries to pretend that she's not going to be bothered by it, but Marie is. But when Debra and Ray are in bed that night, Debra's really annoyed at Robert, and I think she's annoyed at herself as well, because she said, I don't want to be like your mother. So I feel like, and I don't love this quality about Debra, but I can understand. I feel like she said something that was the opposite of what Marie was saying, because she's worried that she's starting to think like Marie. So I can understand why she'd be concerned about that, but she shouldn't deny how she really feels just because that's also how Marie feels. And Ray listens to Debra and kind of sees that there are two sides to Debra. The Debra who presents herself in one way in front of other people, and the Debra behind closed doors. And this is not new to this episode. We quite often see Debra behaving in different ways. I know most people do that, but I feel like with Debra it is quite extreme. And this is something that I have mentioned before, that Debra's not always a very nice person. She doesn't always have the most reasonable responses to things behind closed doors. Was her response here reasonable? I think her opinion was reasonable. I think the way she was expressing that opinion was not great. But Ray sits with his information and he goes to talk with Robert the next day. And we have this lovely scene in Marie and Frank's kitchen between Ray and Robert. And Ray says that breaking up with Erica could be fun as well if they're just having fun. And he refers to Debra as Darth Debra, which I rather liked and I think is pretty accurate. And Robert listens to Ray. He was quite surprised that people thought that way, and I think for a moment it seemed like he was listening and was going to break up with her. I don't necessarily think he should, just because that's what other people thought, but it did seem like maybe he was starting to see what they could see. But he then shows up at Frank's birthday party with Erica. Marie asks her if she'd like some milk, which is incredibly inappropriate. Frank is treating her very nicely, but also kind of creepily, because she's a young, attractive woman and he's being a little bit disturbing. So Marie walks up to Frank and talks really loudly at him to make him seem like he's deaf, basically making him seem like he's perhaps older than he actually is, or at least to emphasize the fact that he is quite a bit older than Erica. And Frank asks Erica what her scent is, to which Marie responds, all right, Frank, we don't sniff the guests, which I loved. And Marie and Frank get into this argument, and Frank's about to storm out, and he shouts, goodbye, to Marie, and then turns to Erica and says, nice to see you again, Erica. Just the shift there I thought was really brilliant. So the party's ruined. So Marie and Frank have obviously gone their separate ways, and Ray, Robert, Debra, and Erica decides to go to a restaurant. Debra kind of drags Ray along, and we're in the restaurant. Ray and Robert go to the bathroom, so it's just Debra and Erica. And Erica's talking with Debra, and this is the bit I did not see coming. Twice, actually, there are two things. Erica reveals to Debra that she's only 19. She's not 22. And yes, that's only 3 years, but I think the fact that she's still a teenager is a big deal. And Debra's response, I think, was fair, which it was brilliant. And she said that this is insane. And Robert comes back from the bathroom, and of course it's really awkward. And I think maybe a minute, maybe less than a minute after that, Debra reveals that Erica is 19. And Erica thinks, well, it's not a big deal. Robert's 35. It's only 16 years instead of 13. And then it's a bit awkward again, because Robert's 43, not 35. And that is a big age difference. And it's not to say it couldn't work, but it is a big difference. And the fact they both lied about their ages, I think, is also a big deal. And I loved how the rest of the scene played out. Erica left, and Ray, Robert and Debra are all talking about this, and then they really start to show their age. Robert going to order pizza, so Ray says no onions because he can't do onions after 8, and then it turns out Ray has to pee again, and I loved it. Very, very relatable. I realise I'm only 32, about to be 33, but that being said, these are things that are definitely becoming more apparent as one gets older, and it ends with Ray and Debra in the bedroom and Ray's singing and winding her up. And it was a nice, fun way to end things. I like the episode. I think it does raise the question, how old is too old, or how big of a gap is too big of a gap? I feel like definitely as you get older, the bigger gaps aren't as important. For example, 19 and even 35 does seem like a huge gap. A lot can happen, even with mental development. Your brain's still developing when you're 19. That does seem like a big deal, but 50 and 66 or 35 and plus 16 is 51. That it doesn't quite seem as severe. It's still a big number, but it doesn't seem quite as severe as 19 and 35. So I think it's less about how big the gap should be and more about how old you are and where you are in your phases of life. And I think it definitely is quite an interesting episode. And also just makes it very clear that there's no point in lying about your age. Because A, they're going to find out eventually. And B, there's a risk that the other person is also lying about their age. There's an episode of Friends where this happens. And I feel like it's such a great topic for a sitcom to address. Because yes, you can get so much comedy out of it. But also I think it's quite an important topic. And I don't think there's necessarily a right or wrong answer. But I do think somebody in their 40s dating a teenager is probably never going to work. Maybe it could, I don't know, but it just doesn't seem like a great idea. That's what we see here, certainly. Debra was unreasonable in places, which is often the case with Debra. As much as I love her, she's not always reasonable in her actions or her... I don't want to say she's not unreasonable in her emotions because they're her emotions and that's fair enough. But I think sometimes she overreacts to situations. And often she doesn't see the seriousness of some other situations. She's a very complex character. I love her, but she's not always in agreement with my way of thinking. Let's put it that way. Either way, I think this is a great episode. Definitely a lot of comedy. Most of the comedy for me came from Frank and Marie, but that final scene, or the penultimate scene in the restaurant, I thought was brilliantly done. And all things considered, I think Young Girl is a really solid episode of Everybody Loves Raymond, and ultimately one that I'm sure I'll always really thoroughly enjoy.